Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to this edition of In Focus as part of the German Marshall Fund's U.S. Foreign Policy Monitor. My name is Keil. I'm a fellow with the Geopolitics and Security and Defense teams here at GMF. Today, I'll be joined by non-resident fellow Michael Kimmage. Michael is also a professor at Catholic University, and he also served under the Obama administration at the State Department as part of the policy planning team, and he handled portfolios for Ukraine and Russia. Thanks so much for joining us here today, Michael.
Thanks for having me, Stephen.
So we're going to try to kind of take a shot at a very top line look at the priorities in Russia policy for the new Biden administration. And so I'll just go ahead and start right off, Michael. I know that the Biden administration basically ran out of the gates when it came to Russia policy, specifically looking at the extension of New START. So clearly there was a plan in place. Now that that's behind us, I was just wondering if you could maybe go ahead and let us know maybe what your idea of some of the key strategic priorities for the Biden administration is vis-a-vis Russia.
Well, I think that New START was on the top of the agenda because of timing, that they didn't have too much of a chance to wait on that. And so they did that as soon as possible. And I think that arms control and whatever you can gain through arms control, those kinds of negotiations, relationships, that is certainly prominent on the Biden administration agenda, but it's not the top of it. So I think the first item on the agenda, and it's going to be a long-term one, is developing greater internal resilience toward Russian meddling in American politics. Sort of Russian capacity to pump disinformation into the political culture of the United States, and I think there'll be a related set of concerns with NATO allies and with other allies about, trying to make progress or reverse the course of what we've seen in the last 10 years, which is increasing Russian boldness, increasing Russian capacity to wreak havoc in big ways and small. I think that the second agenda, which will be, sort of pursued in tandem with the revitalization of certain longstanding U.S. alliances about which Trump had mixed feelings, is going to be a return, if not quite to democracy promotion, although that may come in due course, to understanding democracy as integrally related to U.S. national security. So the fact that Russia is an authoritarian government, the fact that it partners with other authoritarian governments like Syria, Belarus, China, Iran, and many more, is of real concern to how the Biden administration is going to understand the international system. So it's curbing Russia's malign activities. Second agenda will be boosting the fortunes of democracies and doing so with an awareness of what Russia is and what Russia signifies. And then you could think of a third priority, which takes us back to arms control, which will be establishing certain guardrails in the relationship, seeking ways to stabilize and to prevent the relationship from spinning out of control. But I would put the three priorities in precisely that order.
That's very insightful the way that you frame that. I mean, I kind of wonder, as every administration sets out from inauguration, they always kind of think in broad terms about what can be achieved and what cannot be achieved, particularly on the Russia portfolio, which has been perennially problematic. There have been many talks of resets and resets that haven't necessarily gone off the way that folks had envisioned them. As you kind of look at these maybe three discrete priorities that you've identified, and maybe beyond, I guess, just broader dynamics in the relationship, what kind of limitations do you see in what's achievable? I mean, really, where should the administration be thinking more broadly about the Russia portfolio?
Right. So the Biden administration has sort of officially dispensed with the idea of a reset. They're not going to seek a honeymoon period. And, of course, President Biden has a longstanding relationship with President Putin. He's certainly not new on the job. And, he was vice president for 8 years prior to the Trump administration. So there's a lot of history there. And I think that that's one of several reasons why there won't be a reset. I think that this is a problem for the Biden administration that will extend beyond Russia. It's hard to know the exact contours of American leverage at the moment. The United States remains the world's preeminent economy, sort of just remains the preeminent economy in the world, but that in the next 10, 15 years is a position that may be overtaken by China. The U.S. enjoys enormous military powers, which are sort of crucial for the enactment of certain agendas within American foreign policy. But then when you get to sort of soft power, and we've already used the term democracy promotion, sort of what the U.S. stands for, I think this has simply become more complicated. And the world itself has become more complicated, certainly, than it was from Washington's point of view in the 1990s. So it will be interesting to see, and it will be a task of the Biden administration to figure out where their leverage is really strong and what some of the limits on their leverage are. And I wouldn't be surprised if Russia would be the test case in this respect. I think when it comes to resilience, the first of the three agendas that I mentioned, I think that they will make great progress. I think that you can do this kind of work with the allies. Some of it is integrating ideas from the expert community. Some of it will be working with state governments in the U.S., with businesses, sort of big tech and such, to provide better security and to help people to understand what disinformation is and to sort of clarify the information space in the U.S. That seems to me one place where leverage and aspirations are closely intertwined. The second agenda of sort of shoring up the world's democracies and making sure that Russia doesn't have the capacity to pull the rug from beneath them is going to be a lot more tricky. I think there you have some of the old problems, that you have allies like Poland and Hungary and other countries that are not exactly democratizing at the moment. Whatever populism is, it's a story that's certainly unfinished. You have issues of inequality, and we just had a sort of semi-armed assault on the U.S. Capitol on the 6th of January, and we live clearly at a moment that is, in some sense, perilous for democracies, and that's internally perilous. And the role that Russia and China is going to play there is very, very is hard to figure out. So there, I think leverage is a more complicated affair, and in terms of forging some kind of working relationship with Russia, I think the leverage is clearly there for that. But if the Biden administration becomes more ambitious, and the idea is really to build a democracy in Belarus or to build a democracy in Russia, or to enable that process, and to see Navalny and figures like Navalny as the future of Russia, and to seek ways of sort of making Putinism a thing of the past, I think there the leverage that the U.S. has is very, very small. And there I would worry more about a disparity between the rhetoric, the kinds of things you've seen Secretary of State Blinken say, we demand the immediate release of Alexei Navalny, things in that mode. I think he hasn't quite said that, but statements that go in that direction. I think there you might see a disjunction between what's asked for, what's wished for, and what the U.S. can deliver. So I think the democracy front is the one that's is the most complicated.
Yeah, that's right. And you also bring up an interesting point there, and I think that's of interest to a lot of folks that are probably watching this video, is the role of allies and partners, I guess, in these endeavors. I mean, there obviously is some room for overlap. I think you've already kind of hinted at that a little bit. I guess maybe if you want to expand on that a little bit, but I'd also be interested to hear where you think there are points of genuine maybe conflict or confrontation. I mean, I think a lot of people are assuming that transatlantic relations in the new administration will be easier. I guess on the Russia portfolio, sometimes it's less clear. And I'd just be interested to hear what you think there.
What you've seen, I think, already in the case of Navalny, and you had the expulsion of 3 European diplomats a few days ago from Russia, and then countervailing expulsions of Russian diplomats from Germany and Sweden today, and you see statements of support coming from the State Department, and you've seen in general with the sort of Navalny situation as it unfolds, is a much higher degree of coordination among the allies than had been visible in the Trump years. And I think that's a sign of things to come when it comes to sanctions policy, when it comes to sort of dealing with human rights violations in Russia, and perhaps if there's a security crisis that explodes in Belarus or elsewhere, I think that you'll just see that the lines of communication will be open. And, on balance, when you look back in the last 10, 15 years with Russia, the more coordinated transatlantic policy is, the more effective it is. So I think in that sense, so far, so good. And I think that the Biden administration is analytically correct in saying that, in effect, the long-term answer to the Russia problem, if we want to use that phrase, the long-term answer is transatlantic unity. And a clear set of priorities, capacity to cooperate, and sort of an ability to sort of push off Russian efforts to split or divide and conquer when it comes to the transatlantic relationship or the West. If you look a little bit more at the details, I think the policy problems become a little bit more difficult. Of course, you have polarization in American politics, but I don't think that that's going to affect Russia policy for the next 4 years. What you have is a fairly high degree of disunity within Europe, whether you define Europe as the NATO alliance and you put a country like Turkey in the mix, which is getting closer and closer to Russia and has done a lot of things really to annoy and irritate the United States, or if you define Europe as the European Union. I've mentioned Poland and Hungary in terms of the democracy issue, but the European Union contains a huge range of opinion on Russia. You have countries like Spain and Italy for whom Russia just isn't that important. You have France, which has been trying to seek something of a realpolitik modus vivendi with Russia. You're getting some signs of that from some of the candidates for the chancellorship in Germany. You have, on the other hand, Britain and the Baltic republics and most of the countries of Eastern Europe that would like to see a harder edged Russia policy. So the Biden administration will simply have to navigate that. They're familiar with the problems. They have good diplomatic relations with all of these countries. I don't think it's not doable, but there's both a East-West division in Europe, and there's a kind of realpolitik. I don't want to say it's a softer position toward Russia, but in some ways a bit more conciliatory, versus another approach that would like to see Russia squeezed and sort of containment or something even more robust than a containment policy. So I think the task of the Biden administration was to be very clear about its own agenda, its own strategy, its own priorities. And I don't think they're going to get perfect unity from Europe, but to make sure that they have a sort of relevant and plausible coalition of partners there. And on the EU-US level, again, the more coordination, the better. But that won't be easy.
Yeah, I mean, that brings another question, just given recent events with High Representative Borrell going to Moscow and kind of the fallout that we've seen since, being one example of where there might be some divergence, I guess, between the US and EU on how to manage the current situation. And then the other being, with important national partners like Germany on Nord Stream 2, I mean, there are some persistent issues. I mean,
yes.
What is the best way for, I guess, the Biden administration to navigate these thornier issues that flare up and that will flare up from time to time?
Well, when it comes to Nord Stream 2, I think there too, the issue of US leverage is going to be simply very interesting. It's sort of remarkable how long Germany has stuck with that through thick and thin. They don't seem to be compromising again. If you look at the election in Germany, at least the CDU candidate doesn't seem willing to sort of budge on that issue. And there's, I think, still a fair degree of consensus between the SPD and the CDU about going forward with Nord Stream 2. Of course, the Greens and there are other political constituencies that would like to see the project stop because of Navalny and because of what Russia represents. I think that I don't have an answer to how the Biden administration could resolve that problem. I think that they have the asset of a very strong relationship with Germany. Of course, it's just early days, but I think that you can see that there's a lot to work with now between these two countries, and perhaps they can figure out something behind the scenes. I don't think that anything very public or politicized would be advisable, but perhaps they can work out some kind of compromise solution. There have been noises about that in the last 2 weeks, and we'll sort of see what happens. But to return to the EU's the EU visit to Moscow this week, I do want to articulate something that I think is important, and it's important because it's an unpopular position at the moment. That was interpreted as a humiliation for the EU, and there's an aspect of that interpretation that you just can't engage in diplomacy with the Russians, because they'll do what Lavrov did. They'll grandstand, they'll take advantage of you, they'll sort of do sneaky things behind your back, like expel diplomats at the time that they're engaging in the diplomatic conversations. And I think that that's true up to a point. But I think what it repudiates is not so much that diplomacy per se is impossible between the West and Russia. And of course, you do see the New Start example as a sort of counterexample, I think that what's not advisable at the moment is anything public. So, I think that there's sort of an interest that the countries of Europe have and that the US has in building up certain diplomatic connections to Russia. But, there are no deliverables that we can think of in the short term. There's a lot of mistrust. And I think in some ways, um, we on the Western side can only lose when this stuff goes out into the public sphere. But I still wouldn't reject a quieter, sort of more private form of diplomacy. In some ways, for the Biden administration, that's going to be unavoidable, I suspect, because JCPOA is not going to be doable. It's not possible to return without some, sort of discussion, conversation with Russia. And in general, in the Middle East, I think Russia is sort of there to stay in Syria, other places, and there to some degree of deconfliction and diplomacy is going to be necessary. So it's important what happened this week in terms of Lavrov's behavior and statements coming out of Moscow, very sort of worrisome and ugly behavior on the Russian part. But I would be careful not to overinterpret that to say that, well, the only language the Russians understand at this stage is force or some such argument, and we should take diplomacy completely off the table.
Yeah, but to your point, maybe again it signals some of the hesitation around doing things more publicly and some of the blowback that you can get from it. So yeah, it's a very interesting point. Well, this has already been a fairly wide-ranging conversation from specific U.S. priorities to how allies and partners will react. I wanted to ask one more question here before we close it up, and that is, how do you see Russia responding to the changed administration? Has there been a change? Is there a new expectation, or is it more of the same?
I think there's one thing that the Russian government, Putin, the Russian government appreciates at the moment when it comes to Biden. And, yes, I think there was much that the Trump administration sort of did that pleased Russia and all of the complicated connections there. But I think in some respects, Trump was very difficult for the Russians to deal with. And he was difficult because he was unpredictable. He was sort of erratic. As everybody knows, there wasn't much of an interagency process in Trump foreign policy. And so you never really knew, I think, it wasn't just Russia's problem, but it was a problem for Russia too. You never knew what you were going to get, and you never knew how credible it was and how long lasting it was going to be. So I think that there's a certain sigh of relief in Moscow that what you have is a more conventional American foreign policy with a more conventional process, and it's sort of easier to engage. I would be very surprised if President Biden would tweet 6 months from now that he's going to pull out of New START or something like that. And that's the kind of thing that every country had to worry about when Trump was president. So it's not all bad news from Putin's perspective when it comes to Biden. But I think that where the Russians will be neuralgic, in part because there's a new tone in Washington, but in part because Putin's grasp on the Russian population is weakening, is on democracy promotion. And I think that, too, was a story of this week. It didn't quite make the headlines with the EU meetings in Russia, but I think Russia cannot stand the kind of statements the EU has been making about Navalny and democratic process in Russia, and they really can't stand it when it comes from the United States. So there was a State Department statement, I think, of 8 to 10 days ago that we sort of stand with our allies and partners in the Russian opposition movement. Now, take that for what it's worth. You can stand by in the sense that you want to see free elections in Russia. It can just be a statement of affection or esteem. Or if you're Putin and you sort of read these things in a very dark light, you'll interpret that as meddling and interference. So that will be a flashpoint. That will be a flashpoint where Belarus is concerned, because Belarus and Russia are intertwined, and the opposition movements there are in some ways connected. So that is something that I think the Russians will be looking very closely at. Does the U.S. commitment go beyond rhetoric? You see, some of the things that happened sort of in Ukraine, 2013, 2014, will those perhaps replicate themselves in Belarus? And if they do, from Russia's perspective, I think the response will be quite harsh. I think I would just infer from this particular issue that Russia is going to seek out ways to ratchet up the tension and find points of confrontation with the United States. Whether it would be cyber meddling, I'm not so sure it will go to that level, but it will be other things that sort of signal Russian disapproval and try to. I mean, this is the language that we use with Russia, but I think they often think in somewhat similar terms. Try to impose costs on the U.S. for anything that resembles democracy promotion. That this will then be distorted and sort of discussed in Russian media is a given. But more interesting is the sort of policy response, and I would anticipate that 2021 will be a year of sort of steady and probably increasing confrontations between Russia and the U.S.
Well, Michael, you've given us a bunch of food for thought here. It's been pretty quick and wide-ranging conversation, but thank you so much for your time, and thank you to everybody for tuning in. And we'll have more of these coming out soon. But again, thank you, Michael, so much for providing us your insights on Russia policy under the new Biden administration.
Great pleasure to be with you, Stephen, and to be with the larger GMF community.
Thanks.